Dust hung in the evening air like a veil, catching the last of the sun's fading light. The main street of Dry Creek lay stretched between weathered storefronts, where windows blinked with the glow of kerosene lamp. Horses shifted in their reins, hooves striking sparks from the hard-packed earth, while townsfolk murmured in low, judgmental voices. Their gazes all seemed to tilt toward a single figure moving slowly along the road, a figure marked not by sin but by sorrow. Clara May's steps dragged in the dust, each one an act of will. Her shoulders were narrow beneath her faded calico dress, and though the wind pressed the fabric close to her frame, it was her back, hidden but not forgotten, that bore the weight of whispers. She had once been a wife to a cattleman, a rancher known more for cruelty than for love. His death should have freed her, but instead it opened a door to scorn. He had left her no children, no legacy, and in a town where a woman's worth was measured in sons and heirs, her empty womb was counted as a curse. They said she was barren, said she was useless, said her husband's grave was lighter because she had failed him. The worst of it had not been the words, but the night when she had been dragged before the townspeople, tied to a post, and punished under the cold eyes of her neighbors. 100 lashes across her back, each one a tally of shame. She had not screamed, not once. The silence had unnerved them, but they kept on, and when at last she was untied, she fell to the ground with dignity still burning in her eyes though her flesh was torn open. Now she lived in the shell of a shack at the edge of town, her world reduced to thin blankets, a broken stove, and the company of loneliness. She kept to herself, venturing out only when necessity demanded. Women turned their heads when she entered the mercantile. Men looked through her as though she were already dead. Even children, taught by their mother's sharp whispers, avoided her shadow. Each day was another reminder that she was unwanted, unnecessary, unclaimed. But she endured. Each morning she rose, stiff with pain, and forced her body to work. She gathered firewood with trembling arms, mended clothes that no one would buy, scrubbed laundry that others had left for her at the back step, coin tossed without so much as a glance in her direction. She did what she could, and still she barely lived. Nights were the hardest. In the silence she would trace the scars with her fingertips, ridges like a map of a life beaten into her flesh. She would close her eyes and wonder if there was a reason she had been left breathing when so many others might have given up. Sometimes she thought survival was the cruelest punishment of all. It was on one such day, beneath a pale, unforgiving sky, that a man stopped beside her in the street. Jonas McGraw was not one to invite gossip. He was known to speak little, his voice low and steady like a river's hum. His wife had died some years past, leaving him with 2 children and a ranch that demanded every ounce of his strength. He carried grief the way others carried tools, always at hand but never flaunted. Folks respected him, but they did not know him. He preferred it that way. Clara had bent to gather fallen logs outside the mill when the bundle slipped from her arms. The wood scattered, striking her legs and rolling into the dirt. She froze, too aware of the eyes watching her from porches and windows. Before she could stoop to retrieve it, Jonas stepped forward, his shadow falling across the ground. He crouched, gathered the logs with ease, and placed them carefully back into her arms. Clara flinched, startled by his nearness, expecting perhaps a sneer, a word of mockery. But he said nothing, only tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her standing with the wood clutched tight and her heart pounding in her ears. It was a small thing, a single gesture, but for Clara it was the first kindness shown to her in years. That night she lay awake, staring at the flicker of candlelight, recalling the moment his hands had brushed the wood into her grasp. Not her skin, not her scars, just the work she struggled to carry. He had treated her as if she were still a person capable of bearing weight. The thought burned like a fragile ember in her chest. But in a place like Dry Creek, even the smallest ember could spark wildfire. The following morning tongues wagged. McGraw was seen helping her, they said at the barber shop. "What business has he with the barren widow?" murmured women at the well. Children overheard and repeated the words until they rang like bells across the town. Clara, ashamed to be the cause of scandal, avoided the main street. She lingered by back alleys and kept her head low, praying that if she made herself small enough, invisible enough, the talk would pass. It did not. Jonas's children, Mary and Thomas, noticed her presence all the same. Mary, bright-eyed and 8 years old, carried a torn dress seam one afternoon and brought it shyly to Clara. "Can you fix it?" the girl asked, her voice uncertain but hopeful. Clara hesitated, her hands trembling. Then she took the fabric, thread, and needle, and with quiet precision mended the tear. When she handed it back, Mary's face bloomed with a smile that seemed too pure to belong to this town. "Thank you, ma'am," she said, curtsying as she'd been taught. Clara's throat tightened. She managed a nod, unable to speak. It was the first time in longer than she could remember that gratitude had been directed her way. That evening, she sat by her shack's dim fire and pressed the memory of Mary's smile against her heart, as if it were something she could keep safe. Jonas saw, though he did not speak of it. He watched from a distance as Clara bent over a child's dress with scarred, careful hands. His eyes, hardened by years of loss, softened. In her he saw not a woman ruined, but a woman still standing. He recognized the strength it took to keep breathing in the face of cruelty. He understood silence as a language, and Clara's silence spoke volumes. Yet Clara herself remained caught between fear and longing. She knew too well the sting of gossip, the bite of rejection. To be seen by Jonas was to risk being dragged once more into the light of judgment. And still, something deep within her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was not the end of her story. That night, as wind rattled through the gaps in her roof, she lit a single candle and undressed with slow hands. Turning her back to the mirror's cracked glass, she traced the scars that crossed her skin. They looked like rivers carved through dry land, reminders of every lash she had borne. She closed her eyes, and in the stillness breathed a prayer not for escape, not for vengeance, but for courage. "If there is more than this loneliness," she whispered, "let me be brave enough to find it." And as the candle burned low, Clara felt something stir within her, fragile as hope, quiet as dawn. A feeling that the world had not yet finished with her, that beyond the pain lay something worth reaching for. She did not yet know what form it would take, only that she was not ready to surrender. The night carried her words away, and the town slept, unaware that the barren widow's story was only beginning to unfold. Jonas McGraw began to leave small offerings that spoke louder than words ever could. A neat stack of firewood appeared beside Clara May's door one morning, cut and split with care. Another day, a bundle of kindling was laid just so, each piece trimmed to the same length. Clara hesitated before touching them, uncertain if she should feel gratitude or humiliation, yet she could not deny that her nights were warmer, her stove brighter. She told herself it was nothing more than pity from a man too decent to let her freeze, but when the gifts continued, always delivered in silence, her heart started to beat differently when she saw his shadow across the fields. Mary, his daughter, began to come more often, sometimes with small treasures cupped in her hands, a cluster of wildflowers, a bead she had found in the dirt, a ribbon she thought Clara might like. Clara accepted them awkwardly, feeling both humbled and unworthy, but the girl's wide-eyed trust was impossible to refuse. Thomas, the boy, approached more cautiously. He once brought her a scrap of leather and asked if she might stitch it into a pouch. Clara obliged, and when she handed it back, he gave her a quick nod that seemed to seal an unspoken bond. These simple gestures chipped away at the walls around her heart, walls built high after years of cruelty and isolation. Still, in Dry Creek, kindness never went unnoticed. Gossip thickened like smoke. Whispers curled through the saloon, slithered across the church pews, and seeped from every porch. "Jonas McGraw's losing his senses," one ranch hand muttered. "Imagine taking up with her." Mothers warned their daughters to keep their distance. Men shook their heads with grim amusement. The widow, they said, had snared herself a benefactor. Clara, hearing the murmurs, withdrew further. She stopped walking the main street altogether, creeping instead along alleys and fences. The shame she had carried for so long grew heavier under the weight of fresh judgment. Jonas, though a man of silence, could not ignore the voices forever. The church elders summoned him one evening. Beneath the stern gaze of oil lamps, they spoke of his duty to his children, of the stain that the barren widow would bring upon his household. Their words struck with the precision of knives, not because they revealed anything new, but because they echoed the town's cruelty. Jonas left with his jaw set, but Clara, who overheard fragments of their rebuke as she lingered outside, felt the old wound reopen. She walked home in a daze, her mind spiraling through the memory of the lash, through the sting of leather and the heat of humiliation. By the time she reached her shack, rain was dripping through the roof, soaking her dress, and she sank to the floor with tears she could no longer control. Words, she realized, could scar deeper than any whip. 4 days she avoided Jonas and his children. When Mary knocked timidly at her door, Clara did not answer. When Thomas left a small pouch of dried apples on her step, she could not bring herself to open it. She convinced herself that distance was mercy, that by severing the fragile thread between them, she might spare them from further ridicule. Yet in her solitude, the hunger for connection gnawed more fiercely than any hunger of the body. Her prayers grew quieter, almost whispered into the dark. Let me disappear. Let them forget me. The turning point came on a Sunday, when the entire town gathered in the square after church. The air smelled of dust and horses, hymnals still clinging faintly in the air. Clara, hoping to slip by unseen, wrapped a shawl tightly around her shoulders and kept her gaze fixed on the ground. But whispers rose around her like a storm. A voice, sharp and cruel, cut through the murmurs. There goes the barren widow, carrying her shame like a badge. The words struck with venom, and Clara's knees weakened. She might have fled if not for the sudden shift in the crowd's silence. Jonas had stepped forward. He did not raise his voice, yet his words carried with the weight of stone. A woman's worth ain't measured in children, he said, his eyes scanning the crowd. Her worth is in surviving what most of us could not. You call her barren, but my children call her friend. Soon enough, they'll call her mother. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Some scoffed, muttering about scandal and desperation. Others fell silent, chastened by the gravity in his tone. Clara stood frozen, her shawl clutched tightly around her, her heart pounding as if it would burst. Jonas extended his hand toward her. She shook her head, panicked, but before she could retreat, Mary and Thomas ran forward, each seizing a fold of her skirt. Mary beamed with pride. Thomas held her hand with quiet certainty. In that moment, Clara's scars ceased to be marks of disgrace. They became proof of endurance, of a spirit not yet broken. She allowed Jonas to take her hand. His grip was firm but tender, and she felt herself anchored in a way she had not known in years. Around them, the crowd's judgment hung heavy, but Clara no longer bowed beneath it. Something inside her straightened, as if the whip had carved not shame but strength into her bones. Days later, she crossed the threshold of Jonas's homestead, carrying nothing but a small bundle of belongings and the courage to step into a new life. At first, every gesture felt tentative, sharing meals at a rough-hewn table, mending clothes while children laughed nearby, listening to Jonas's quiet hum as he worked in the barn. Slowly, the rhythms of family life seeped into her, filling cracks she had thought permanent. She learned to rise not to silence but to the sound of young voices, to fall asleep not to loneliness but to the warmth of a home. Love did not arrive in a thunderclap or a declaration. It grew instead in steady increments, in the way Jonas left a mug of coffee waiting for her in the mornings, in the way Mary slipped her hand into hers without asking, in the way Thomas placed his finished chores before her as if seeking silent approval. Clara discovered that motherhood was not bound by blood but by presence, by the choice to stay. Looking back, the narrator's voice would one day say, "The riches of that woman were greater than any ranch, greater than any lineage." She had been stripped of dignity, Yet she had found it again in the eyes of children who chose her and a man who dared to defy the weight of a town's scorn. And so the tale of Clara May, once the widow whipped for being barren, ended not in silence but in abundance. Her scars remained, etched forever across her back, but they no longer whispered of failure. They sang instead of survival, of love found when all hope seemed gone. Remember this, dear soul who listens: scars do not diminish you. What the world calls empty, the heart may call overflowing. Love never demands proof, only presence. And when it comes quietly, as steady as the turning of the earth, asking nothing more than that you endure long enough to receive it.